The air on that crisp April afternoon still carried the last stubborn chill of a Michigan winter. For 18-year-old Emma, a week at her grandmother's farm was a welcome escape. But as she wandered behind the old red barn, she heard it. A thin, reedy cry. In the weeds, not a barn kitten but a bobcat, mud-matted, shivering, blue-eyed, and barely bigger than 2 fists, shivering violently. She knows the rule. Wait for the mother, don't interfere. But this was a baby abandoned in the weeds. Scooping him up, Emma and her grandmother Rose began a desperate fight for his life. They knew cow's milk would be a death sentence, and painstakingly fed the fragile creature drop by drop from an eyedropper. The kitten, now named Rusty, began to thrive, developing a purr as deep and resonant, a sound he reserved only for Emma. But keeping him was illegal. With a heavy heart, Emma made the call to the Department of Natural Resources, her voice wavering as she explained the situation. The officer's voice was all rules and penalties, until the tiny bobcat on Emma's lap did something so extraordinary, it stopped the official mid-sentence and changed everything. The air on that crisp April afternoon still carried the last stubborn chill of a Michigan winter. But the sun, hanging high and brilliant in a pale blue sky, promised that spring was finally winning the argument. For 18-year-old Emma, the scent of damp earth and awakening life was the official perfume of freedom. Freedom from school, freedom from the city, and freedom to spend a week at her grandmother's farm, a place where time seemed to slow down, measured not by clocks, but by the slow crawl of shadows across the vast rolling fields. She was wandering behind the great sway-backed barn, its red paint faded to the color of a setting sun, when she heard it. It wasn't a bird's chirp or the rustle of a field mouse. It was a thin, reedy cry, almost too faint to be real, like a memory of a sound. Emma froze, her worn leather boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. She scanned the line of tangled weeds and last year's cattails that bordered the woods. Nothing. She took another step, and the sound came again. A desperate, wavering mewl that snagged at her heart. Parting a curtain of overgrown thistle, she saw him. He was a miserable little ball of fur, no bigger than her 2 fists pressed together. His coat, a beautiful pattern of tawny brown and dark, inky spots, was matted with mud and burrs. He was shivering violently, a tremor that shook his entire tiny frame. His eyes, a startling blue that wouldn't have looked out of place in a summer sky, were slitted against the bright light, and they were fixed on her with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to hiss, a sound that came out as a pathetic puff of air. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This was no barn cat. The ears were too long, tipped with delicate black tufts. The paws were enormous, comically oversized for his body, and his tail was a short, expressive stub. A bobcat. A wild, honest-to-goodness bobcat kitten. Her first thought was of his mother. She stood motionless for a long time, listening, her senses straining for the sound of a twig snap or the low growl of a protective parent. The woods remained silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the budding oak trees. The kitten cried again, a sound of profound loneliness that decided things for her. Protocol and common sense said to leave wildlife alone, but looking at this shivering, abandoned creature, protocol felt like a cold, distant concept. This wasn't a wild animal in its element. This was a baby dying in the weeds. With movements as slow and gentle as she could manage, she knelt. "Hey there, little guy," she whispered, her voice soft. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." He flinched as her hand drew near, but he was too weak to move away. She scooped him up, her hands easily encompassing his small body. He was shockingly light, a fragile collection of bones and fluff. Tucking him inside her fleece-lined jacket, she felt the frantic hummingbird beat of his heart against her own ribs. He went still, whether from exhaustion or a flicker of trust, she couldn't tell. As she walked back toward the warm, welcoming light of her grandmother's kitchen, Emma had no idea that she had just appointed herself the reluctant and completely unqualified nurse to a tiny striped orphan. Her grandmother Rose was standing at the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water. At 75, she had a face mapped with the fine lines of a life filled with laughter and hard work, and her eyes, the same warm brown as Emma's, missed nothing. She turned as Emma entered, a question forming on her lips that died the moment she saw the look on her granddaughter's face. "Well now," Rose said, drying her hands on her apron, "what have you got there, sweetheart?" Emma gently opened her jacket. The kitten blinked, looking even smaller and more pathetic in the bright kitchen. Rose let out a low whistle. "Oh my, a bobcat. Haven't seen one of their little ones up this close in 30 years. There was no judgment in her voice, only a quiet, practical concern. Together, they fashioned a makeshift nest from a cardboard box and an old wool blanket, placing it near the gentle warmth of the wood stove. The first challenge was hydration and nourishment. Rose, who had raised everything from lambs to orphan raccoons in her long life on the farm, knew that cow's milk would be a death sentence. "There's a feed store in town," she said, already reaching for her car keys. "They'll have kitten milk replacer. You stay here and keep him warm." While she was gone, Emma took a soft, damp cloth and began to gently clean the kitten's fur. He squirmed weakly at first, but as the warmth seeped into his chilled body and the gentle strokes soothed him, he began to relax. She worked meticulously, teasing out the burrs and wiping away the grime, revealing the stunning, intricate pattern of his coat. It was like polishing a hidden gem. By the time Rose returned with a can of KMR and a set of tiny bottles and droppers, the kitten looked less like a castaway and more like a miniature king. But getting him to eat was another battle. He turned his head away from the bottle's nipple, his wild instincts warring with his desperate hunger. Emma's heart ached with every refusal. She remembered reading somewhere that you had to be patient to make them feel safe. She settled into the old rocking chair, the kitten cradled in a towel on her lap. Instead of forcing the bottle, she just held him, humming a tuneless song her mother used to sing to her. After a quarter of an hour, she tried again, this time with a simple eyedropper. She squeezed a single drop of the warm milk onto his lips. His little pink tongue flickered out, tasting it. He wrinkled his nose. She squeezed another drop. He licked it away more deliberately this time. And then, a small miracle occurred. He began and Emma felt a surge of triumph so fierce it almost made her laugh. She gently wiped his whiskers with the corner of the towel. Exhausted, the kitten's eyes drifted shut. His paws, with their hidden needle-sharp claws, began to twitch and dance as if he were chasing invisible chipmunks in his dreams. Looking down at the sleeping creature, so fierce and so fragile, Emma felt a profound and slightly terrifying shift inside her. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a promise. They decided to call him Rusty. The name seemed to fit the reddish, rust-colored undertones in his fur, a color that reminded Emma of the old, forgotten pieces of farm equipment that lay half swallowed by the tall grass at the edge of the property. things that were once useful and strong, and just needed a little care to find their purpose again. The first few days blurred into a cycle of 2-hour feedings, gentle cleanings, and long, quiet naps in the rocking chair. Rusty grew stronger with astonishing speed. His cries became more demanding, his movements more coordinated. He began to explore his cardboard box, batting at the folds of the blanket with his giant paws. And he began to purr. It wasn't the gentle, rhythmic rumble of a house cat. It was a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to start in his toes and buzz through his whole body, a sound as raw and untamed as he was. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated contentment, and he reserved it exclusively for Emma. By the end of the week, Emma's spring break was over, but the thought of leaving was impossible. She called her parents, explaining the situation with a torrent of words, her voice filled with a passion that surprised even herself. After a long conversation with Rose, who assured them Emma was being responsible, they reluctantly agreed she could stay on for a while longer, as long as she kept up with her schoolwork online. But a shadow hung over their peaceful routine. Both Emma and Rose knew that keeping him was not an option, and likely not legal. "He's a wild animal, Emma love," Rose said one evening as they watched Rusty ferociously attack a knotted-up sock. "He doesn't belong in a house. The greatest kindness we can show him is to prepare him to go back where he belongs." Emma's heart clenched at the words. She looked at Rusty, who, having vanquished the sock, now trotted over and tried to climb her leg, his tiny claws snagging in her jeans. How could she give him up? He was so small, so dependent. The world outside was full of predators, cars, and dangers he couldn't possibly comprehend. "I know, Grandma," she said, her voice thick. "I just look at him. He wouldn't last a day." "He will if he's given the chance," Rose said mildly. "But he needs experts. We have to call the Department of Natural Resources. It's the right thing to do." With a heavy heart and trembling fingers, Emma looked up the number. A man with a tired, gravelly voice answered. "DNR, Officer Miller speaking." Emma explained the story, her voice wavering. Officer Miller sounded weary, as if he'd heard 1,000 similar stories from well-meaning people who mistook kidnapping for rescue. "Ma'am, you shouldn't have touched him. The mother was likely just out hunting," he said, his tone flat and official. "You need to bring the animal to our facility immediately. It's illegal to possess protected wildlife." Tears pricked at Emma's eyes. "But he was freezing. He was going to die. There was no mother. I waited and looked for hours." "That's what everyone says?" he sighed. "Look, just bring him in. We'll take it from there." At that exact moment, Rusty, who had finally succeeded in scaling the mountain of her leg, flopped onto her lap. He rolled onto his back, a furry spotted starfish, and began to purr. It wasn't his usual contented rumble. It was a full-throated, engine-like roar of happiness that vibrated up through Emma's whole body. It was so loud that she had to pull the phone away from her ear. "What in the world is that noise?" Officer Miller asked, his gruff tone replaced by genuine curiosity. It's him," Emma stammered. "He's purring." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Emma could picture the man in his drab office, surrounded by paperwork, suddenly confronted with this undeniable, audible proof of life and affection. "He's purring that loudly?" he asked, a hint of wonder in his voice. "He does it all the time," Emma said, stroking Rusty's exposed, spotted belly. "Especially when he's on my lap." Another pause. "And you said you're at Rose Vance's place?" "Yes, she's my grandmother." "I'll be," Miller muttered, more to himself than to her. I know Rose. Her late husband, George, used to report eagle sightings to us. Good people. He cleared his throat, his official tone returning, but with the hard edges sanded off. Listen, our rehab facility is overwhelmed right now. It's kitten and fawn season, and we're full to the rafters. It's not the best environment for a single fragile bobcat kitten. He hesitated for a moment longer. Rose's property is large and remote, and I happen to know she still maintains her old federal migratory bird rehabilitation permit, which makes things less complicated. Here's what I'm willing to do. I'll list you as a temporary foster sanctuary under my direct supervision. I'll bring you the proper food, a list of instructions, and a larger enclosure for when he's bigger. But you have to promise me one thing, young lady. You have to remember he is not a pet. Your job is to make him strong enough to leave you. Can you do that? Emma looked down at the snoring kitten, his belly rising and falling, his tufted ears lolling to the side. The thought of him leaving was a physical pain, but the thought of him thriving in the wild, free and strong, was a flicker of light. Yes, she whispered, her voice filled with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. I can do that. The agreement with Officer Miller transformed the farmhouse. It became an official, if unconventional, wildlife rehabilitation center. Miller was true to his word, arriving the next day with a truck full of supplies, bags of specialized food, a wire mesh enclosure for the porch that could be expanded as Rusty grew, and a binder thick with information on bobcat development. He was a kind man in person, with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. He showed Emma how to begin weaning Rusty onto solid food, mixing a slurry of meat and formula that the kitten attacked with gusto. Life settled into a new, extraordinary routine. Every afternoon, after her online classes were done, was playtime. Rusty, now sleek and muscular, had outgrown the knotted sock and graduated to chasing peacock feathers that Emma tied to a string. He would stalk them with the deadly seriousness of a seasoned hunter, his backside wiggling before he launched himself through the air in a clumsy, acrobatic pounce that usually ended with him skidding across the polished wood floor. It was a furry, four-legged contradiction. One moment, he would be the epitome of wildness, his eyes locked on a sparrow outside the window, his body coiled like a spring. The next, he would hear Emma's voice and come trotting over, rubbing against her legs and demanding to be picked up. The afternoon nap became a sacred ritual. Emma would settle into the big armchair with a book, and without fail, Rusty would leap onto her lap, circle 3 times, and then flop down with the dramatic abandon of a fainting Victorian lady. His head would rest on her knee, his spotted belly would be offered up for scratches, and his snores, a rumbling growl that was, in fact, louder than Grandpa George's old John Deere tractor idling in the barn, would fill the quiet house. In those moments, scratching behind his tufted ears and feeling the weight of his utter trust, Emma would pretend he was just the world's tiniest, most exotic couch potato. She told him about her plans for college, her arguments with her friends, her secret fear that she didn't really know what she wanted to do with her life. He would just snore in response, the most comforting and non-judgmental friend she'd ever had. Grandma Rose watched it all with a wise, knowing smile. She'd share stories of her George, a man who loved the land with a quiet reverence. He always said the farm wasn't ours to own, just ours to look after, she told Emma one evening, as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. That goes for everything on it, from the corn in the fields to the critters in the woods. As spring warmed into a lush, green summer, Rusty grew. His eyes faded from baby blue to a piercing, intelligent gold. His spots became more defined, his muscles more powerful. He learned to use the large enclosure on the porch, climbing its branches and practicing his pouncing on the live mice Officer Miller would bring, a development that Emma found both fascinating and slightly gruesome. She was watching his wildness return, bit by bit, and it was both her greatest success and her deepest sorrow. The day she knew their time was running out, she was watching him from the kitchen window. A fat, gray squirrel was chattering indignantly from a branch just outside the enclosure. Rusty wasn't playing. He was crouched low, his body utterly still, his tail twitching almost imperceptibly. The focus in his golden eyes was absolute. It was a look she had never seen before, not of a playmate, but of a predator. The squirrel, sensing danger, flashed away. Rusty watched it go, a low growl of frustration rumbling in his chest. He looked back at the house, at Emma, and for a fleeting second, his gaze seemed distant, as if he were already looking past her and into the deep woods beyond. Officer Miller's visits became more frequent as summer began to fade into the golden hues of autumn. He'd stand with his hands on his hips, watching Rusty, and nod with satisfaction. "He's looking good, Emma," he said during one visit. "Strong, alert. He's got a good weight on him. Another month or so, and he'll be ready for the final stage at the main sanctuary. They have a massive, multi-acre enclosure there where he can learn to hunt for himself, with no human contact. It's the last step before release." Each word was a small, sharp stone pelting Emma's heart. She knew this was the goal. She had promised. But the reality of it, the impending silence in the house, the empty space on her lap, was a looming dread. The night before Miller was scheduled to take him, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Emma sat with Rusty on her lap for the last time. He was almost too big now, spilling over her knees, but he settled into his usual spot, his head tucked under her chin. His purr was a deep, soothing thrum against her chest. She buried her face in his soft, warm fur, a scent she knew she would never forget, and the tears she had been holding back finally came. They fell silently, soaking into his coat. "You have to be a good boy, Rusty," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You have to be smart and strong. You have to watch out for the big animals and the fast cars. You have to be the king of the woods, okay?" He just purred, oblivious to the heartbreak in her voice. After a moment he shifted, lifted his head, and gently licked a tear from her cheek with his rough, sandpapery tongue. It was a simple, instinctive gesture, but for Emma, it felt like a goodbye. The next morning was gray and overcast, matching her mood. Officer Miller arrived, his expression gentle and understanding. He set a large travel crate on the porch. The finality of it was suffocating. "It's time, Emma," he said softly. She nodded, unable to speak. She walked to the enclosure, her feet feeling like lead. Rusty trotted to the gate to meet her, rubbing against the wire mesh. She didn't cry. She had done her crying last night. Now was the time for strength. This was her final act of love for him, the hardest one. She opened the gate, and instead of having Miller coax him into the crate, she knelt down and called his name. He came to her, and for a moment she hugged him tight. Then she stood up and walked to the crate, leaving the door open. "Okay, Rusty," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "In you go." He looked at her, then at the crate. And then, with a trust that shattered her heart into a million pieces. He walked inside and sat down. Miller closed the door, the click of the latch echoing in the quiet morning. She stood on the porch with her grandmother, watching the truck drive down the long gravel lane until it was just a speck, and then nothing. The house had never felt so big or so quiet. The weeks that followed were difficult. Emma threw herself into her studies and helped her grandmother prepare the farm for winter. But everywhere she looked, there was an absence. The empty rocking chair, the still, untouched shoelaces, the profound silence where a deafening purr used to be. She began volunteering at the Maine Wildlife Sanctuary on weekends, needing to be around people who understood. She learned more about the complex, heartbreaking, and rewarding work of rehabilitation. She saw other animals on their journey back to the wild, and it gave her a sense of peace. One evening in late October, as a hunter's moon hung low and orange in the sky, Emma and Rose were sitting on the porch, wrapped in thick blankets and sipping hot cider. The air was cold and sharp. They didn't talk much, just watched the trees sway in the wind, their last remaining leaves rattling like paper. Then Rose stiffened, her gaze fixed on the edge of the woods where the fields began. "Emma, look." Emma followed her gaze. There, at the boundary between the tamed and the wild, stood a silhouette. It was a bobcat, larger than she remembered, but with the same confident posture. It was sleek, powerful, and perfectly at home in the encroaching twilight. It stood motionless for a long moment, its head raised, testing the air. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. "Rusty," she whispered. As if he'd heard her, the bobcat turned its head and looked directly at the farmhouse. It didn't move closer. It didn't make a sound. It just looked, its golden eyes seeming to find hers across the distance. It wasn't the look of a pet longing for home. It was a look of acknowledgement, a silent, fleeting connection across two different worlds. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. The tears that came to Emma's eyes this time weren't of sadness, but of a deep, overflowing joy. He was okay. He was free. He was home. She looked at her grandmother, who was smiling, her own eyes glistening in the moonlight. Emma realized that the gaping hole in her heart didn't feel so empty anymore. It had been filled with something vast and warm. Saving one small, orphaned life had stretched her own heart wider than she'd ever imagined possible, making room for a love that knew when to hold on and when to let go. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest wildness you ever get to tame is your own capacity to love something enough to set it free. And that feeling, she knew, would keep her warmer than 1,000 blankets.